Okay, and welcome to the Nature and Nurture chapter. In the Nature and Nurture chapter, we're going to talk about the phrase nature and nurture, explain what it means, where it comes from, and how it actually applies to modern psychology. To get started with, we'll define the terms nature and nurture. Nature and nurture both refer to the biological and environmental control of behavior that's seen in human behavior. Nature refers to the sources of biological control, typically seen as things like genetics and general biology. In contrast, nurture refers to control by the environment. Now, these two concepts are fairly general, were originally created in the 1880s, and are going to have slightly different meanings and slightly different application today. To understand how the term was developed and has changed into a modern conception is one of the things we're going to be doing over the coming slides. The story of nature and nurture really gets started in 1859, which is one of the dates that you hear about consistently in this semester. 1859 is the year that Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. Now, Darwin's work on his theory of evolution was entirely dedicated to understanding the physical and behavioral developments of creatures on the planet through the basis of heritability or genetics. Anything that transfers through the process of sex to the offspring. Darwin was not overly concerned about the role of the environment in managing behavior, other than to make arguments that the environment was part of a feedback system into the genetics of a species, so that as the environment changed, the set of genes that created a species had to change, and over enough time, a new species could be developed. So, evolutionary theory starts at about 1859, and also please remember that this is 20 years before the beginning of experimental psychology. So, for anyone who is investigating the role of evolutionary theory at about this time in history, they are absolutely not psychologists, but they are primarily biologists. Now, evolutionary theory has since become the cornerstone of modern biology. In fact, it primarily focuses today upon the genetic aspects, which are components of the entire system that our technology will allow us to access today. Back in Darwin's time, the concept of DNA or genes in general were not really well understood, and in fact, they just generally talked about heritability. As far as psychology goes, the role of evolutionary theory helps explain the degrees of similarity in the neurological structure between a variety of animals. So, for example, when you take a look at jellyfish, rats, monkeys, humans, they all are very different species. However, the nervous system of all these creatures, as well as literally thousands of others, all have some similar properties with respect to the neural structure that we talked about in Chapter 2. That is, in Chapter 2, we talked about how the neuron has three basic anatomical parts: the dendrite, the soma, and the axon, and the roles that they played, the manner in which cells were connected together through the process of neurotransmission, the rules about cells communicating with other cells that have the same neurotransmitters, and so forth, are all the same rules that apply for creatures like jellyfish that don't really have a true brain, but just a network of cells that helps manage it, through to things like rats and monkeys and humans, which clearly do have a brain, but in these creatures, as varied as they are, have very similar anatomical structures to their brain. So let's ask this question. What is similar about the neurons in lab rats and humans? Take a moment and I'll give you the answer. The answer is E, all of the above. The neuron synapse, neuron structure, the existence of neurotransmitter pathways, the role of myelin, a brain that analyzes sensory input and motor output, all of those aspects are consistent across all creatures that have any nervous system, including ones that don't even have a specific brain, such as a jellyfish. Now, one of the main tenets of evolutionary theory is the role of natural selection. Natural selection is something you're probably generally familiar with. It's essentially the argument that the environment and the set of genes play an interactive role in feedback, which establishes how the set of genes change over the course of generations. So typically, the most common examples are the role of climate on Earth. As tectonic plates change, as weather patterns change over the course of time, species adapt to either warmer or colder climates, and as a result, their physical characteristics will change. But it's also expected that their behavioral characteristics would change as well. Darwin did not speak too much about behavioral characteristics, but for what he did expect that essentially genes were going to establish the patterns of behavior for any particular species. So the adaptive characteristics that are going to be the ones that most likely start to take over the patterns of behavior or the physical characteristics of the creature tend to occur only because the new generations of offspring can make it to the age of reproduction and then reproduce. If that did not happen, then any adaptive evolutionary change that occurs in the parent would simply drop off of the entire process, right? You have to acquire a genetic change and then pass it off to your offspring. And then after generation, those genes, which are associated with more adaptive patterns of behavior or more adaptive physical characteristics, will become more prevalent in the population simply because the members of the species that have that characteristic will simply be more likely to survive. It certainly doesn't guarantee it, but it's just a probabilistic argument. Now, many things will follow that logic very easily. So, for example, when we talk about global warming today, if the world was continuing to get warmer and warmer, people that have difficulty managing the heat will simply be more likely to have any number of different types of medical problems and simply be more likely to die off. So even though you wouldn't see it in a single individual or over a couple generations, over the course of 1,000 years maybe, you may be able to see changes in human evolution in terms of adaptations to a warmer climate. There are a variety of things that people mistakenly associate with evolution, and you see that in the very bottom bullet point on this slide. Such things as your IQ and your annual salary. In general, your IQ is not positively associated with greater adaptiveness to the environment, nor is your annual salary. These ideas are often mistakenly used in television programs when you're talking about the modern application of evolutionary theory. The idea that your IQ and your annual salary are connected with reproductive success implies that smarter people or richer people will do better in society and therefore have more protections for their children. And in general, that sounds like it might be true, except it's not. Generally, when you look at people across the globe that have higher IQs, which is usually because they have much more education, those individuals have a tendency to have smaller families. And that usually is by design. Individuals that stay in school for many, many years and work very hard at their jobs purposely have smaller families because they recognize that they can't put any amount of time to parent large families. On the other hand, individuals that have decided to not go for extensive educational or job training or to make their career the center of their life, oftentimes may find family to be of a higher priority, and that a large family would actually be a sign of success for them. Individuals with a lower IQ may tend to have larger families, but there certainly is not a cause and effect relationship in this correlation. And this idea oftentimes is incorrectly associated with success in society today, and that's simply not true. When you look specifically at the characteristics related to human beings that may have been established through natural selection, there are always a few things that you can immediately take a look at regardless of the species. Things such as food acquisition, which of course humans and all other species have to do. Mate selection, which if it didn't happen, the species would die out. And parenting. There has to be some sort of parenting style. Even in the case of sea turtles, for example, where eggs are dropped and the parent just shimmies away, that's a parenting style. Or in other cases, like with a human being, typically parents will take care of their children for a minimum of 18 years. Which is oftentimes a legal standard in many societies. So you find a wide range of parenting styles, and each one of them is going to be associated with some particular species. The question in this case, however, is really related to whether or not you can find specific food acquisition or mate selection or parenting techniques that exist in a species, not because somebody trained it, but because it just naturally occurs. And in that sense, you would make the argument that it was biologically determined. In a more older term sense, you would say it was an instinct that led to the pattern of behavior. So could you find evidence for biologically controlled patterns of behavior in human beings? Well, you absolutely can. And there are three things here, just sticking with some of the bullet points that we were just talking about. You do find across the world today and throughout recorded history lots of evidence for omnivorous feeding. Sure, there are societies that are vegetarian, and there are certainly people today that consider themselves vegan. But in all cases, they tend to be a small minority. And in fact, if you remember from chapter 1, all of the arguments that you make in the behavioral sciences are always going to be based off of statistics, a statistical likelihood, not a guaranteed 100% effect. So in this case, the evidence points to the fact that humans tend to eat all things, plant matter, insects, as well as meat, fish. Speech. You always find speech associated with human beings. Of course, there are some people that don't speak, yes, but again, statistically, speech is a normal property of human society. There are no human societies in which there is no language. It simply doesn't exist. Bipedalism. All humans walk upright. You see it in every society. There is no society in which humans walk on all fours. And in fact, the questions about speech and bipedalism have actually been around for many, many decades in the field of psychology, because the training of speech and walking on two legs is often done in part by the parents. So it was never really very clear whether or not children naturally develop speech and naturally walk on two legs, or if speech and walking on two legs is developed through the process of learning as a result of parental influence. After many decades of work, it appears that in both cases there is an interaction between parents and the children's capacity, but that speech and walking upright does not occur until essentially the child is actually ready. But once they're ready to speak and once they're ready to walk upright, then the parental influence, which typically tends to be there on a daily basis, will then start to capture the attempts of the child to speak or to repeat sounds or to walk or stand up, as small children will do, pulling themselves up on furniture. And then you'll see that parental influence start to manage that pattern of behavior over time. What about mate selection strategies? No different from any other species, human beings do have a tendency to find mates in a particular way that you can find consistently around the globe. And not just around the globe today, but also around the globe throughout recorded history. A lot of cross-cultural research has been done, and it's important to recognize that this work is cross-cultural because this is not a North American standard. This is a standard of planet Earth. And what you wind up finding is that there is actually a very long list of traits that men look for in women and that women look for in men. And that long list tends to have all of the same characteristics on it. With minor exceptions, men are looking for characteristics in women that are the same that women are looking for in men. If you take those two lists and place them next to each other, they tend to actually follow very similar priority structures as well. At the very top of the list, however, you do tend to see a slight variation. And these are the characteristics that most people socially tend to identify as being the differences between men and women. But it should be a very important point for you to recognize that overall, the characteristics that men look for in women and that women look for in men are essentially the same. And with minor variation, the priority of all of those characteristics is nearly identical. It is only at the very top of the list, the most prevalent characteristics, that tend to be slightly different. In this case, what you tend to see is that males are attracted to characteristics of youth and health in women, and that women are attracted to accessible resources. Now, how these two things play themselves out and how they fit into the broader story of natural selection has been debated for many decades. However, there has been a storyline created through evolutionary psychologists, those researchers that take the role of natural selection and try to use it to understand the development of modern behavior. And that story is a mixture of environment and genes over the course of evolution of human beings. Between males and females, who can have children? Only women. Women become pregnant and men don't. In fact, in terms of sexual reproduction, the role of a man is actually very short-lived, contributes sperm, and then that's it. The role of the woman is actually much more extensive because not only does she become pregnant, but she becomes pregnant for 9 months. Then, having been pregnant for 9 months, she then gives birth and has a baby. The guy could have been gone 9 months at that point. In fact, the role of the man and the woman in this case seems to be the basis by which men and women start to develop mate selection strategies. If you're an individual who's going to wind up in a 9-month pregnancy and then have a child afterward, wouldn't you be very careful about who you dated? Right? It would make more sense to be highly selective. And in fact, of all the characteristics of a man, you would look for an individual that could take care of you when you were slowed down by your pregnancy and even further slowed down by the need to take care of an infant. An individual that would show strong signs of commitment and a high degree of resources would make a good option for a mate because that individual will stay with you after you become pregnant and would have resources to be able to take care of you and the child. On the opposite side, men, because their contribution in sex is very short-lived, would tend to take a strategy in which they would try to spread their sperm as much as possible. And neither one of these approaches should seem very odd to anybody in society today. In fact, those are basically the stereotypes of men and women on the dating scene. That guys are just trying to get out there and find somebody to have sex with, and women are going out there and trying to find somebody that's going to be a good boyfriend. Now, of course, those are stereotypes, and there are plenty of guys that actually want to have a committed relationship, and there are plenty of women that want to be promiscuous. But those, again, are always in the statistical minority. When you look broadly at all men and all women, the patterns of behavior that are represented here on this slide are also represented for the majority of members of society, for every single society that has been evaluated around the globe over the past many decades that the behavioral science has been doing cross-cultural research. Now, coming off of natural selection, there is another concept called artificial selection, and it's actually the second of three forms of selection that we're going to be talking about: natural selection, artificial selection, and something else called selection by consequences we'll be getting to in a couple of slides. Artificial selection is the process of natural selection managed by human beings. Many things that humans modify specifically is oftentimes referred to as artificial, simply because it didn't occur naturally. And that's somewhat of an odd categorical statement to make, because there's nothing unnatural about a human being doing anything. If a human being does something, then that would just be natural because the human being did it. In these scenarios, though, the term artificial selection refers to the human control of the management of the gene pool. So rather than letting tectonic plates or climate change occur over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, you can have human beings specifically modify the gene pool of a particular creature by selectively breeding members of that species together. And that, of course, is a process that has gone on for thousands of years on the planet. And it certainly started in farming and still exists in farming today. Farmers for millennia have bred their cattle, their goats, their chickens together in a way to try to enhance the characteristics of what they want from that particular creature. Larger eggs, more meat, more milk, more fur. For sheep, when you're going to use their wool for making fabric, there are going to be characteristics that you decide upon. And so upon domesticating the animals and keeping them on a farm, you can selectively breed them to try to enhance those characteristics. And certainly that has been done for thousands of years, and is essentially the basis by which you see the wide range of domesticated cats and dogs today that we have as house pets. Most of them would not actually exist in the wild. Certainly such things as hypoallergenic dogs or hairless cats are things that are simply human-created manifestations of the gene pool. There's no reason why a hairless cat should actually exist in the wild, given that its lack of fur would actually put it at a selective disadvantage, given its exposure to the sun and biting insects and other types of things. So these are just characteristics that exist mainly because of human intervention. And so then it's called artificial selection. Now, if you were to take the concept of artificial selection and apply it to human beings, it then gets a special term. It's called eugenics. And eugenics is a term that means good genes. Eugenics is a term that developed in the 1880s by Sir Francis Galton and was an extension of evolutionary theory through artificial selection being applied to human beings. So when Darwin created the concept of evolutionary theory and argued that the gene pool would change over time based upon the interaction between the environment and the genes, you can then intervene on that gene pool and selectively breed human beings together for the particular traits that you want, in the same way that you would breed farm animals together to enhance particular characteristics that you want. So back in the 1880s, theoretically, the idea was put forth that if you found members of society that tended not in their family line to have particular diseases or disorders, or that had high levels of intelligence or very good vision or any number of other characteristics that you thought were good, you could simply selectively pull them out and request that they produce more children. And then in so doing, you would enhance those characteristics in the gene pool from society and thereby over time make a better breed of human being. As you'll read in the textbook, this concept of eugenics becomes more and more applied throughout society, mostly driven by scientists that kind of see the positive aspects of breeding humans together to eliminate disease and make people smarter and so forth. It eventually ends up in concentration camps during World War II, where you selectively identify individuals that you don't think are worth being alive and should never contribute their genes to the next generation, and then simply having them killed off. And that happened to lots of people with mental illness, or if they had a particular ethnicity and so forth. Those camps were essentially created in a way to eliminate those particular gene pools or any contribution genetically from those individuals for the next generations. In 1859, Darwin comes out with the theory of evolution. 100 years later, people are still arguing over the idea of whether or not evolution could actually change patterns of behavior. By 1959, it seemed reasonably clear that the biological changes in a creature, such as their fur and their height and their weight and how quick they were and the placement of their eyes and any other physical characteristic of a creature, very likely had strong evolutionary components to them. But the question was still out about behavior. Could behavior actually be bred into a creature? And so in 1959, a group of Russian biologists in Siberia set out to figure out this question. And what they did is they started by collecting 130 foxes from the wilderness out in the area where they were. They had about 30 male and 100 female foxes at the start of the experiment. And as wild foxes, these foxes were very skittish and aggressive toward human beings because they were not domesticated animals. They were wild creatures that were captured and brought back to this laboratory. So the way this research operated to see if you could apply artificial selection to generate a more tame fox was the primary goal of this experiment. So allowing the foxes to breed randomly, the pups of the first generation were evaluated very carefully by the Russian scientists to determine the 5% least fearful, least aggressive toward the Russian scientists. So as the foxes bred, they produced pups, and the pups were evaluated for fear and aggression toward humans. The 5% least fearful, least aggressive were allowed to become the breeding stock for the second generation, and all of the remaining foxes simply dropped out of the experiment. Silver foxes reach sexual maturity in about a year. So after a year goes by and they start to breed on their own, the Russian scientists again evaluate the 5% least fearful, least aggressive pups from that second generation. Those become the breeding stock for the generation afterward, and all the remaining foxes simply drop out. And this takes place approximately once every year, given the length of time it takes the silver foxes to reach sexual maturity. And it goes on for year after year after year. And in fact, the experiment takes place over the course of about 35 years, so approximately 35 generations of silver foxes go by. And what is found is that the 35th generation is much less fearful and much less aggressive toward human beings. In fact, the foxes in that 35th generation are so domesticated that they actually serve the purpose of being very good house pets. The pattern of the foxes is actually very similar to what you would describe a domesticated dog. It runs around your feet, it licks your face, it's friendly to play with, it likes being around human beings. And at this point, 35 years into this experiment, it's about 1994 in Russia, where they're having economic problems as a result of the change of the government. And these Russian biologists realize that they can actually begin funding their own research by selling the foxes that they've bred to people who are interested in getting exotic pets. And so even though this artificial selection experiment taking place over 35 years served its purpose to show that you could breed in selectively patterns of behavior into a mammal, it also served since that time an opportunity to fund research in biology. And so still today, you can buy the later generations of pups that have been bred at this facility in Siberia. Simply go on Google, search for Russian silver fox experiment, and you will eventually click your way through to find a research facility in Novosibirsk, Siberia, where these foxes are still bred and cost approximately $7,000 to $10,000 a piece. Now let's take a look at this question that's related to this story. If behavior could be changed in humans at the same rate as in the fox experiment, how long would it take to change human behavior considering 40 generations at 20 years per generation? So, in the Russian fox breeding experiment, the silver foxes reached sexual maturity after about a year, and after about 35 years, there was a significant change in the pattern of behavior of the foxes. So just to make these numbers nice and simple, we're going to say that if you're breeding human beings, you're going to have to let them get to 20 years of age for sexual maturity, and we'll make the number simple and we'll say 40 generations has to go by. How long would it take to change through a selective breeding process patterns of human behavior on the assumption that some master race of space aliens came down and started to breed us? Of course, the answer would be 800 years in this case. 20 times 40 is going to be 800. And of course, there is no guarantee that the rate of change that you would see in a human species would be the same as in a silver fox. But I do this just by comparison to show how long it would actually take if breeding patterns of behavior into silver foxes actually followed a somewhat similar pattern as it might in humans, right? And this is purely theoretical. If it took you 20 years to get to the point where a person could produce children, then it would take about 800 years. And in a scenario like this, it really tells you just how long, how much effort it would take to try to selectively breed new patterns of behavior into a human being. The third form of change that we're talking about, from natural selection to artificial selection to selection by consequences. Selection by consequences is the only one of the three that is not a genetic process that we're discussing. Selection by consequences is actually a learning process that occurs over the course of your life and is not involved in a genetic change. What we see in this case is phylogenetic processes that manage genes are conceptually similar to ontogenetic processes that manage behavior, in that the environment and genes play a role in an interactive sense, that as the environment changes, the gene pool has to adjust so that the species can survive in that new environment. If you look at this over the course of a person's life, it's called ontogenetic or ontogeny. So it's not really a genetic aspect, it's an aspect of learning that occurs in a person's life. And in this case, the metaphorical similarity is that your environment actually has pressures on you to change your behavior in particular ways, so that there are rewards and punishments out in the world, and that you have to decide which patterns of behavior to display. Of course, it would be a natural process for you to search out the rewards and to avoid the punishments. And in those circumstances, you see patterns of behavior emerge that consistently track the rewards of the environment, so that those patterns of behavior become more and more prevalent over time. And that's, again, analogous to the way that the physical environment modifies genes over time. If the world becomes colder and colder and colder as it goes into an ice age, people and other animals have to become more and more adapted to a cold, dry earth. So when we take a look at ontogeny, or selection by consequences, patterns of successful behavior will be more likely to occur in the future, and patterns of unsuccessful behavior will be less likely to occur in the future. When you say this, it sounds like for any one person, they should essentially be perfect, right? If your adaptive behavior and the behavior that leads to social reward is always being enhanced, and that the patterns of behavior that are punished always disappear, then why isn't everybody perfect? And the answer is actually rather simple, and that's because your environment is constantly changing. Even metaphorically similar to the whole story with natural selection and genetic change, the environment on Earth is always changing. It's changing always at a slow rate, but you do see that there's never a point where any species is perfectly designed and is born and lives a somehow perfect life without any problem, no disease, no other kinds of injuries ever occur to it. That simply doesn't occur. Because the environment is always changing, there is always a process by which the gene pool has to catch up with the changes in the environment. And you see that with behavior as well. Your environment changes actually much more rapidly in a day-to-day, year-in, year-out process when you're talking about psychological events, and you are always trying to catch up with it. So you're always adapting to new changes. You may have many of the successful patterns of behavior in your repertoire. However, there's always some degree to which you actually have to change over time. So one of the examples I like to walk through in a case like this is on this slide here at the bottom. Imagine a 10-year-old girl that lives at home with an abusive parent. And the specifics of why there's an abusive relationship in this case is not really relevant. The idea in this case, the context that I'm setting, is that the child has to learn to adapt to live in that abusive environment. Patterns of behavior that this girl would develop over time to survive in this environment would probably be things like staying quiet, avoiding her father, not doing anything that might make him angry. So if he gets mad when she fails a quiz from grammar school, she knows she may wind up getting a beating or yelled at very forcefully. She may work harder on her homework. She's not going to try to impose herself and take control of the television set while her dad's sitting there drinking a beer. She's not going to be very boisterous and make a lot of noise in the house. She's going to tend to be very quiet, tend to stay in her room, and avoid other family members because any interaction with them may ultimately lead to a beating. When this girl turns 18 years of age and moves out to get away from her father, does she take her problems with her, or does a new postal address wipe clean her entire history? Of course she carries her problems with her because all of the learned patterns of behavior that were adaptive in the environment of abuse are the patterns of behavior that she's been trained to exhibit, and all those patterns, of course, literally exist in the wiring in her brain. So as she gets a new postal address across town and lives in a safe environment, she would still feel comfortable exhibiting many of the timid patterns of behavior that she learned over the course of her life. And in fact, those patterns may be so ingrained in her that she may not even recognize them as being problematic. They may just seem normal to her. Consequently, if she decides she's going to get married and have children because she wants to prove to herself that she could be a good parent, a much better parent than her parent was to her, she might find it very difficult to find a permanent mate, someone to fall in love with and marry and have children with. And that would be because of the maladaptive patterns of behavior that she's now exhibiting. What we're going to call maladaptive patterns, now that she's out of her house, were actually the adaptive patterns in the abusive environment. So adaptive behavior in the abusive environment would automatically become maladaptive behavior when she's no longer in the abusive environment. And those patterns would stop her from forming a good relationship with somebody in the future, largely because she's overly timid, she reserves her emotions, she doesn't express herself, and these are not good rules to live by if you want to be in a romantic relationship or if you're trying to get married. So what you see in this case is that as the environment of this girl changes, the patterns that were at one time adaptive become maladaptive because the pattern of behavior does not fit the role for success or generating success in the new environment. So these kinds of things happen to you literally on a day-to-day basis. The people around you, the world you live in, constantly changes, and even the people around you, their patterns, their willingness to talk to you, their attitude may change day in, day out, and you're always having to adjust to how the rest of the world is actually interacting so that you can best fit yourself in for the greatest amount of social reward that you can possibly get. So let's take a look at this question. If behavior is successful in one context, then it will certainly be successful in another context. That is, of course, false. If behavior is successful in one context, it will not necessarily be successful in another context. It always depends upon the context. And this is a general rule you're going to see that will show up across many chapters that we're going to deal with over the semester. Patterns of behavior are going to be very context specific, and it will determine, the context of that environment will determine which pattern of behavior will be most successful.